Hi, good evening, and welcome to Conversations with the Candidates on Houston Media Source TV. I'm Gene Preuss with the League of Women Voters of Houston, and tonight we are going to be talking on this program. We have two sets of guests. This first series of questions I'm going to pose are for candidates, Democratic candidates for Harris County Attorney. And we want to ask them some questions about themselves and about some of the issues so that the voters can get to know and more about them and be better informed voters when we go to the polls, which is coming up on Tuesday if you haven't already voted. So I'd like to welcome both of you. We have Christian Menifee and we have Ben Rose. And both of them are Democratic candidates for county attorney. And thank you for being with us here and with the League to help us learn a little bit more about you guys and some of the issues. So we'll start off here with Christian Menifee. Would you please tell us about yourself and your background and why you decided to run for Harris County Attorney, please?
Sure. So again, Christian Menifee, very grateful to be here. I am running for Harris County Attorney in the Democratic primary. I am the homegrown product of a working class family. My grandfather was a longshoreman at Port Houston back in local 1331, back when the locals were segregated. My parents served our country, United States Coast Guard, and were stationed at local military bases. My brother beat cancer at MD Anderson, and after putting myself through all public schools, undergrad, and then law school, I was the first in my family to graduate college, and I've now practiced law at two international law firms. I started my career at Fulbright and Jaworski, which is the same law firm that Sylvester Turner and Sheila Jackson Lee started their careers at, and I've since moved on to Kirkland & Ellis, and I've been practicing commercial litigation ever since. I decided to get into this race because we need a progressive advocate who's going to relentlessly fight for and protect the people of Harris County. At every turn, we've seen the current Harris County attorney either abdicate his duties or refuse to advocate for the people of Harris County, and that's something that I plan to change when I'm elected. One of the main issues that got me to this race was the bail reform lawsuit, the misdemeanor bail reform lawsuit, which, as I understand, is something that we're going to talk about a little bit later. But having been the child who sat at home writing letters to the family members, I can't wait for you to get home, I can't wait for you to get out of the system, I know what it means firsthand for the criminal justice system to be used against marginalized people. And for our county attorney to defend that process was something that I just couldn't sit by and watch happen. So I decided to get in and fight. And when elected, I plan to advocate for everyday working class people. So again, Christian Menifee for Harris County Attorney, and very excited to be here.
Okay, Mr. Menifee, thank you very much. Ben Rose, I'm going to ask you the same questions. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and why you're running for Harris County Attorney. Sure.
So I'm Ben Rose. I'm running for Harris County Attorney. I'm a fifth-generation Houstonian. My daughters are seventh-generation Houstonians because my wife is sixth-generation Houston. I'm a trial attorney, environmental trial attorney specifically. I received my master's of law in environmental law from Tulane University. And I've been named one of the top 10 environmental trial lawyers in the state and one of the top 40 trial lawyers under 40. What got me into this race was watching the environmental issues that were going on in our county and also watching the flooding related issues. In addition to bail policy, the county attorney is also the chief environmental regulator, and they are the chief attorney for the Harris County Flood Control District. When I was at law school at Tulane for my LLM, I wrote my thesis paper on building a protective barrier. It was the Ike Dike at the time, now it's something else, on building a protective barrier to protect the ship channel from a hurricane. And, you know, that was 2008 was Hurricane Ike, and today's 2020. We still haven't built that. Part of the reason why is the county attorney is supposed to write something called the environmental impact statement. This office hasn't done it, which I find inexcusable. In addition, only 3% of environmental violations in the county are enforced, and I also find that inexcusable. And I think that is a reason why we have these really huge calamities like the ITC fire and Watson and Grinding, but also, you know, it's partly why we have regular flooding. The county attorney is supposed to enforce strict building requirements so that it would be whatever acre you take, you're supposed to make an acre and offset, things like that. And we're just not doing that job. And You know, I think if Houston doesn't tackle these issues, these environmental and flooding related issues, that we're not going to have much of a future 2 generations from now, 3 generations from now. The reason why I started with saying that how long my family's been here, my daughters are 7 generations, is it is impossible to imagine a future for Houston 7 generations from now unless we tackle these issues, unless we tackle our flooding issues, and unless we tackle our environmental issues. And there's really no better office poised to tackle these issues than the county attorney's office. And right now, frankly, the office simply is not doing a good job.
Okay, thank you, Ben Rose. I want to turn to a different topic. You both brought up topics that you're interested in, and we were actually going to address both of these. But we've seen in the news recently some very high-profile cases, especially with child abuse. We've also seen cases of elder abuse that are in the news right now. And this is one of the areas that the county attorney deals with in addition to environment and the bail bonds issue. And I'm going to come back to both of those in a few minutes. But can you talk about what your office is planning on, if you get elected, what your office is planning to do? And Ben Rose, we'll start with you for child abuse and elder abuse.
Sure. So something that I am excited about handling is Child Protective Services. Child Protective Services is an area very dear to my heart. The reason for that is when I was 13 years old, my best friend at the time, his name was Alexander Peterkin, he was killed by his mom. And he was in the middle of a custody dispute. His father tried to get custody, George Peterkin tried to get custody, and the system failed. Custody was given to the mother. She had a terrible drug abuse problem. And this was in a wealthy neighborhood. You know, these things happen in every neighborhood, and I think that's a common misconception. And so, you know, through hiring a very powerful attorney, she was, even though, you know, everyone could testify at the various schools, they were an Audi family, you know, with her drug problem, she ended up killing herself and her children. And you look at the Child Protective Service office and you see just how important of a responsibility is. I think of all the responsibilities that we're going to mention tonight, this office, that is the most important responsibility. And, you know, Christian, I think, had a personal story about bail reform that was moving, and, you know, I focused on environmental law, and those are 2 very important issues, but none are more important than Child Protective Services. And that is an area that the office should always be trying to reach the highest caliber and the highest possible standards with the most attention, because there is nothing more important and more significant than people having a fair and good shot and fair start in life.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rose. Mr. Menifee, I'm going to ask you the same question pertaining to child abuse and elder abuse.
Right, so the County Attorney's Office represents CPS in legal proceedings. So it would be going after parents for endangerment of the children in order to get them out of that household and into a better situation. And so under my leadership, we'll continue to do so. Right now, as I understand, that team is the largest team in the County Attorney's Office, so we'll be continuing to ensure that the most resources are devoted to that team. And there's a separate practice group that handles elderly abuse, and so we would continue to do that work as well. But also using the Deceptive Trade Practices Act to go after the fraudulent businesses that prey on our most vulnerable populations, which include the elderly. An example I always tell is I have a family member who has a learning disability, and he went and purchased a used car. And when he purchased it, the used car salesman told him, oh, well, this car is just fine, this transmission's in great working shape. Well, he drove it off the lot, and about 5 miles down the road, the car broke down because the transmission was shot. But under Texas law, the Harris County Attorney's Office has legal authority to go after those businesses under the Deceptive Trade Practices Act to not only to seek damages, but to get an injunction to stop them from doing that type of practice. So under my leadership, we will do that. We will go after the fraudulent businesses that prey on the elderly, the youth, and folks who are unknowing.
So let me just ask both of you a question. You're talking about the differences between, you know, and the responsibilities of the county attorney. Does anyone get you confused with that you're running for district attorney?
Yeah, all the time. I mean, even family members. I've had uncles, you know, think I'm running for district attorney. It is a very common misconception.
But so the county attorney is more civil cases, while the district attorney is more federal cases.
Right. So the district attorney is the chief legal officer for all criminal matters. So here in Harris County, they prosecute everything from misdemeanors up to felonies. The county attorney's office is the chief legal officer for all civil matters. So representation of the county, county entities, county elected officials, county employees whenever they're sued. You have some legal authority to bring lawsuits on behalf of the greater good of the people of Harris County, and also advising county entities in contract drafting, risk mitigation, serving as their general counsel. But to answer your first question, Gene, yes. In fact, in part, when I go to certain areas of town, I say, hey, I'm Christian Menifee. I'm running for Harris County Attorney. I'm not running against Kim Ogg, just so they'll know.
Right. Well, you know, I was when I was doing the research and you know, putting the questions together, I was Googling county attorney, and I would always get Kim Ogg.
Yeah.
I was like, that's not right. But so thank you for those clarifications.
I do want to say something about this, and regrettably, this is an empty chair. We're both running against an incumbent, and I think part of the reason, you know, I've thought about this office, and I thought about a lot why this office isn't better known, and a quip that I would hear on the campaign trail would be, this is the most powerful office you don't know about. I think the reason why you don't know about it is because the office hasn't been appropriately served.
Okay. So let's get down to the big issue that we were talking about earlier, the bail issue. That's been in the news. We've seen, also we've had law enforcement personnel. There's candidates for Harris County Sheriff. We have seen Art Acevedo, our chief of police, have both been concerned. Law enforcement officers have been concerned about the bail reduction issue. On the other hand, you don't want to put people and punish them for being impoverished or homeless. So where do we draw the line? How do we get a balance between keeping the community safe on the one hand and holding criminals, and on the other hand, not being unfair and disadvantaging already oppressed communities? So Christian, we'll start with you.
Yeah, sure. So as I mentioned, the misdemeanor bail reform lawsuit is the reason why I got into this race. So you had folks who were being arrested for low-level misdemeanor crimes like driving with a suspended license, and we saw that there were two different worlds. Their bail would be set at maybe, let's say, $2,500, and for the folks who could afford to pay the 10% to a bail bondsman to get out, they fight their case, and more often than not, their case would be dismissed. But for the other set of folks who couldn't afford to make that payment, they would do either one of two things. They would either take a plea deal, which would give them a record that could follow them for the rest of their life, or they would sit in jail until their trial, which could be 6 months to a year away. In that lawsuit, the county attorney's office was charged with representing the judges, the hearing officers in the county in the lawsuit. But the office went beyond the pale. They didn't just represent them, they defended the practices. They spent $9 million of taxpayer money defending those practices. They made nonsense arguments, like one of the arguments that the office sponsored through outside counsel was, well, Your Honor, it's not that poor people are in jail because they can't afford to get out. They're in jail because it can be cold outside, and they would prefer the warmth of a jail cell to being out on the street. An argument that was immediately struck down by the judge and was called reprehensible by local elected officials. So this is the role that the county attorney's office played in that lawsuit. Now, the concerns about safety, you know, a lot of these cases have been talking about felony folks who have committed felonies and are getting out with a certain bond amount. But this initial lawsuit that Vince Ryan's office was involved in was a misdemeanor bail reform lawsuit. So it dealt with low-level misdemeanors, low-level crimes, some of which would be punishable by only, let's say, 6 months in jail. So I think it's two completely different issues. Now, to answer the greater question, Gene, how do we solve the problem of making sure that we're not depriving folks of their constitutional guarantees, but we're also keeping the community safe? Well, the answer is individualized hearings. Because one of the issues that was going on with the misdemeanor bail system was it was basically a bail schedule that would say, for this crime, the bail is this amount. For this crime, the bail is this amount. It was a build-your-own-pizza menu. And the problem is it didn't take into account how much the individual who's being accused could afford. And in that process, there really wasn't an individualized assessment into whether this individual is particularly a threat to the community or a threat of flight risk. So the solution should be forcing our judges and our hearing officers to actually sit down and do an individualized risk assessment for each person based on a variety of factors to determine whether this person is potentially a threat to the community, or this person is particularly a flight risk, and not trying to take a one-size-fits-all approach to it.
Okay, thank you, Christian Menifee. Ben Rose, same question. It seems to me that what he's saying is that we need to look at a difference between what kind of crime it is.
You know, I think the reason why this policy area is so tricky is what the public wants around it and what the law requires, or what the law should require, are at odds. And as a lawyer, even if it's unpopular, I believe following the law to where it leads. My stance on the issue is that it's not about the crime that was committed, it's about due process of law. If the principle applies for misdemeanor, it also applies for felony. And the reason why I want to be very careful saying this is I just sort of want to walk people through this that might not be lawyers or might not be familiar with the legal arguments. And again, I only arrive at this position because I believe that it's the only appropriate legal position if you're really thinking about it. So we have due process of law, which means that you're not supposed to be imprisoned without a trial, right? The reason why that's so scary for people is that we know that a lot of times when somebody's being arrested, they're being taken off the streets for public safety. And the idea of those people being on the streets is terrifying, especially if those people are sex predators or a lot of crimes that might frighten us, right? So the way that we worked around that system and the way that we worked around that duality, if you will, for all these years is by the implementation of cash bail. And so what we said is, you know, we still have to provide due process of law, but we'll set your bail at $10,000 or $50,000 or $1 million to make it so that prior to trial, you can't get out. What that did was it made it so that wealthy people that committed heinous acts, like a Harvey Weinstein that shouldn't be on the streets, could be on the streets. And poor people that did nothing wrong were still stuck in jail. And what we're asking for is something that is less of a sledgehammer, more of a scalpel. And it is saying that regardless of the crime, we need to evaluate the person individually and see if they pose a flight risk or if they pose a danger. If they pose a danger, we will keep them in prison prior to their trial, if we have a reasonable basis to believe they pose a danger. And you know, this is it's a brave new world. You know, this is a system that's been in place. This system wasn't unique to Harris County. This was a United States system that Harris County was part of. And this reform is very, very new. And new things can be very scary. And we need to make sure we do it delicately, and we need to make sure that we don't endanger the public, but that we're also fair to the accused. Harris County is not the only one implementing this. Galveston County, which is led by Republicans, is also implementing this. That's just in our own backyard, and I'm sure there's other places in the country that are too. So that is where we really need to be, is instead of doing a one-size-fits-all with cash bail, where we're getting around this really uncomfortable thing, we need to start looking at the individual people so that we can be both protective of the public, which we must be. We cannot let violent predators out on the street, or violent criminals. And some people accused of crime are criminals that pose a danger. But at the same time, not all people are. And it's not fair to keep people in prison that aren't. And we have to be fair.
Well, I really appreciate both of your responses to that because, you know, I don't know if I've said this before, is that, you know, a lot of what I know about the law is from Law and Order, right? And there's always, I think the general public may not be as familiar with some of the issues. And so those were really good responses from both of you and very explanatory as to the differences. So thank you so much for those. We have a few minutes left. I want to ask you a question. So I'm going to ask you to keep your response a little bit short. What do you plan to do in the first 30 days if you're elected in office, Mr. Menifee?
Right, so first day in office, I'm going to dismiss these women from this human trafficking lawsuit. So the office has used public nuisance law to abate sex work in the southwest side of town, Bissonnette. It's called the Bissonnette Tract. But the office has sued not just the pimps, not just the Johns, but also many of the women who have been confirmed by assistant district attorneys here in the county to be victims of human trafficking. So our taxpayer dollars are being used to sue women who are victims of trafficking. My first day in office, I will dismiss those women from that lawsuit. I also plan to take more resources from, for example, the nuisance practice, not spending $9 million to defend a cash bail system, and divert that to building out the environmental group, which right now is about 4 to 5 lawyers out of 120 in the office. We've seen this string of explosions. We know that we need to be more proactive in our approach to trying to prevent these explosions. Watson grinding is a good example. If you have 10,000 pounds of propylene in your facility, you have to file a risk management plan with the EPA. They didn't do it. So identifying those high-risk facilities and trying to get in and do legal action before to prevent explosions. And of course, in order to get that done, you're going to need more than just 4 lawyers out of 120. You'll need a team of investigators. You'll need a more robust practice around that, and so building out that team as well.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Rose.
Sure. So I'm very, very excited about what this office can do. My first 30 days, I want to think about the best ways to restructure this office and to build a truly dynamic office for Harris County. The way I look at this office is sort of taking a step back and not what this office currently is, but what this office could be. And something that deeply troubles me, more so than anything else, is how much this office is underserving the people of Houston from what this office can be. So a story that I like to tell is when I was in law school, I wanted to be a public interest lawyer. I wanted to do something that would deeply help the public. My way around that was to go into trial law, but I more so wanted to do something that was more in an activist role. I found that in the greater Houston legal community, there wasn't that market. So I went up to New York and I interviewed at this group called the PILO Conference. And what I found is and throughout the Northeast, the equivalent of the Harris County Attorney's Office are dynamic and active and taking kids from Harvard and Yale and Columbia and NYU and the best law schools and training them for 4 or 5 years so that they can go out there and then to go and really, really help and serve the public. So that's what I really want to do day one, is surround myself with the best people, find the best people in order to grow the office with, so that we can really create something really dynamic. It's a shame that you don't know what this office is, or you had to look it up. You're one of the most knowledgeable people in Houston. And if you don't know that, no, but you're on the news, you interview candidates, and if you don't know this, how does the average citizen? And this is such an important office. This office should be at the forefront of protecting immigrants, protecting us on the environment, moving Houston forward. This office has the power to sue and the power to defend lawsuits, which makes it a tremendously powerful office. If you look at it, I like to look at where great change in this nation came from, right? Most of the great change in this nation came through the courts and the judicial process rather than through Congress. The courts and judicial arms are more powerful and more important than the legislative arms. I like to think about 3% of environmental violations being enforced. What that means is your county commissioner, your state representatives, your Congress, they're irrelevant. They don't matter if you're going to vote for them and they pass laws, and 97% of the laws that they pass aren't being enforced. And you could pick that issue and you could push it across the board. On human rights trafficking, you had this office being admonished by the ACLU. So that's what I want to do day one. I want to build a dynamic office that can serve across the board on all these issues.
Okay, we've got about 5 minutes left. Thank you very much for that response and for that compliment. Christian Menifee, why should people vote for you, and where can they go to find out more about your campaign?
Right, so I'm asking for your vote because I'm going to completely rework this office in a way that turns it into a place that fights for the everyday Houstonian and the everyday Harris County resident. In the same way that Vince Ryan is absent from this interview, he's been absent at Commissioner's Court when there are important issues that are being discussed by the County Commissioner's Court. He's been absent out in Austin when they're working to pass bills that undermine our ability to have local control and to go after environmental violators. I plan to be very active in this position. I will be at Commissioner's Court providing the legal advice myself when important issues arise. When a Republican-run state legislator tries to undermine local efforts, I will be out in Austin testifying against bad bills that can harm us. When there are important cases on the docket, I will be in the courtroom. Just 3 county attorneys ago, Mike Fleming argued in front of the United States Supreme Court. That's the type of advocacy that I will bring back to this position. You can find out more about my campaign at www.menifeeforhc.com or at menifeeforhc on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. But I would love to earn your support. And again, Christian Menifee for Harris County Attorney.
That's M-E-N-E-F?
M-E-N-E-F-E-E.
Thank you very much. Ben Rose, why should people vote for you, and where can they find out more about your campaign?
Our website's www.benrosetx.com. Super easy. That's the best place to find out about us. In terms of why you should vote for me, I'll build you a truly wonderful office that is what I'd like to consider a feather in Houston's cap, or a feather in Harris County's cap. Right now, as I mentioned before, we do not have this office. You know, it is odd that the average person in Houston doesn't know what this office is, considering the power that this office has and considering the ability that this office can do. I have managed a law firm. You know, I started this interview off with listing the various accolades I received, but more than that, when Hurricane Harvey hit, I signed about 70 of those cases up. They're from the upstream and downstream case. When the Deer Park explosion happened, I signed up 12 of those cases. I've been on the forefront of these issues, fighting for everyday Houstonians. I am deeply excited about the possibility of building a wonderful office that will be there for the people of Houston and that will defend us, that will protect us, that will really be the people's attorney. So that's Ben Rose for Harris County Attorney, www.benrosetx.com, and thank you so much for having me. It was an honor to be here.
Well, Ben Rose, Christian Menifee, good luck on your campaigns. The election is coming up in less than a week, right? It's on Tuesday.
Yeah.
6 days. Yes.
So, and I know you guys have been very busy, and to be fair to Mr. Ryan, he did have another commitment that he couldn't back out of. So, you know, and so thank you guys for taking the time out of your busy schedules right now to come in and share some information. The point is to be better informed voters, and we really thank you for doing that. I think I learned stuff about the office and about what you're going to do, and you cleared up some confusion that I had. So thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be back in just a few moments, and we'll be talking with candidates from the Democratic race for Harris County Tax Assessor and Collector. We'll see you in just a minute.